Great, we're recording. Welcome everyone. This webinar is part of an ongoing series of meetings and trainings hosted by the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice. It's for prosecutors and defense lawyers who are engaged in post-conviction investigations of wrongful convictions. The Quattrone Center is a training and technical assistance provider through the Upholding the Rule of Law and Wrongful Convictions Review Program funded by BJA. Our work under this grant provides trainings on a wide range of topics to help those engaged in post-conviction investigations. Today we have the pleasure to welcome Robin Frankel, Director of the Michigan Attorney General's CIU, and we have Dave Moran, who is Director of the Michigan Innocence Clinic. They're going to talk to us today about their collaborative investigation of the wrongful conviction of Jeff Titus and the 10-year odyssey to free him. Titus was convicted in 2002, 12 years after sheriff's deputies cleared him of suspicion after confirming that he was actually hunting 27 miles away at the
You are
time of the
connected to
crime.
computer audio. Oh, I don't think we have things on, guys. You're right, Ella.
Okay, but that's what I should do. Is there a person in Albany I should reach out to?
The Michigan Innocence Clinic became involved when two deputies called Dave to tell him that the wrong man was in prison for the crime. And the case garnered national attention through the 2020 documentary The Hunted by Jacinda Davis and 16 episodes of the Undisclosed podcast by Susan Simpson. And this was a pretty long and winding case, so to kind of get us oriented, I'm going to quickly play a little news clip about the case, and apologies if there's some a few minutes of ads here. I'll try to get it queued up. Hold on one second.
Oh, you're on a video. You're on a conference call.
Investigation in 2017 raised serious questions about the conviction. Is here now with the latest on this, Ken.
Yeah, Brian and Sue, the AG in court document says there's lots of evidence to show a serial killer who hunted hunters, not Jeff Titus, was responsible for killing two men just yards from each other in Kalamazoo County. The AG's office says the original detectives in that case suppressed that evidence. This all started in November 1990 when the bodies of hunters Doug Estes and Jim Bennett were found near each other in the Fulton State game area, both shot in the back. The original detectives quickly ruled out nearby landowner Jeff Titus, a former Marine, after alibi witnesses told them he was hunting on their property 27 miles away at the time. But that alibi was ignored, Target 8 found, when a cold case team took another look in 2002, leading to Titus's conviction and his sentence to life without parole. He always maintained his innocence.
They should have brought the original detectives in because they cleared me, and I asked him, I said, bring the detectives in, and he never did.
In a court document filed yesterday, the AG's office's Conviction Integrity Unit, working with the University of Michigan's Michigan Innocence Clinic, says there's plenty of evidence that a serial killer named Thomas Dillon killed Estes and Bennett. The unit confirmed that a file on Dillon was in the original detectives' reports on the case, but they say none of those documents were found at the prosecutor's office. They never reached his defense team. Among the evidence, a woman and her son spotted a man in a ditched car near the murder scene and later picked out Dillon from a lineup. They also identified a car that was similar to a car owned by Dillon's wife. Dillon had borrowed two long guns from co-workers the day of the double murder. The men were killed with different weapons. And a cellmate told the FBI that Dillon told him about killing two hunters in a county that police, he said, would never connect him to. The original Kalamazoo County detective told Target 8 he had ruled out Dillon, saying he had an alibi. But the AG's office says Dillon had plenty of time to commit the murders. Dillon died in prison in 2011. Today, the Michigan Innocence Clinic was waiting for a federal judge to sign an order to release Titus from prison. He was 50 when he was convicted. He's now 71. The AG's office has asked not only for an immediate release, but for a new trial. Kalamazoo County after Jeff getting told Target 8 he was waiting for a federal judge to rule on the case before saying whether he would retry Titus. I'm Target 8 investigator Ken Colker.
Oh man, I can't believe I'm missing this.
Sorry about that. Let's see. So now we'll open things up here. Dave, if you wouldn't mind sort of starting things off and just telling us how this case came on your radar. Was it when the deputies contacted you? And if so, what did they say and how did things proceed from there?
It was. So in very early 2012, January 2012, I got a call out of the blue from a Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Deputy, Bruce Wiersema, who told me that there was a man who was in prison for a double murder and that he and his partner, Roy Ballett, knew that the man was innocent. And when I asked, well, how do they know that? They said because they had cleared him personally. So you don't get very many calls like that in the course of innocence work where you have police officers who actually investigated the case telling you that the wrong man's in prison. But we immediately dug into the case. It wasn't hard finding lots of information about the case online because it was a very well publicized case back in 2002 when Jeff had been tried and convicted. And it was actually a very well publicized case at the time of the original crime, which was November 1990. So we pretty quickly put the story together. And here in a nutshell is the story. On Saturday, November 17th, 1990, 2 hunters were killed in the Fulton game area, which is east of Kalamazoo, Michigan. Late in the afternoon, shots were heard sometime around 5 p.m. And then other hunters went to the area and they found that these 2 hunters had been both shot in the back and killed. And there was nobody around at the scene at the time. The police were called. And then a few hours later, Jeff Titus shows up. The killing happened in this game area just a few feet from a farm that Jeff Titus owned. And so a few hours later, Jeff Titus shows up back at his farm and the place is crawling with police. It turns out that day, Jeff Titus was himself deer hunting. This was opening weekend deer hunting season in Michigan. And he was 27 miles away, as that report indicated, in a different county, hunting with a friend on a property owned by an elderly couple that he was friendly with. And so he and the friend knocked off hunting about 6 p.m. They drove back. They stopped at a Burger King for dinner on the way back. And then they come back and there's police everywhere. He tells them that they can use his farm as a staging area for the investigation. And then he goes to a neighbor's house and tells the woman who lives there and her adult daughter what's going on. You know, why are there all these police there? Because there had been a double shooting near his property line. And so the initial detectives are assigned to this case are from the Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Department, Detective Bruce Wiersema and Roy Ballett. And these are the guys who 21 years later end up calling me and telling me the wrong guy has been convicted. So Jeff Titus was a person of interest right from the beginning because the shooting happened right on his property line. And it was true that he was territorial about his property. He had had a number of encounters over the years where hunters had wandered off of the game area onto his farm, and Jeff had confronted them, sometimes at gunpoint, and told them, to get off of his property. So he was a person of interest. But within a few days, detectives Wiersema and Ballett had cleared Jeff Titus. They went and talked to the elderly couple who had the farm 27 miles away, and they confirmed that Jeff and his hunting partner Stan had been there that afternoon, and that they left about 6 p.m. And again, remember, the murder happened sometime around 5 p.m., 27 miles away. So he had a complete alibi. They also talked to the neighbors that Jeff had talked to, and the woman and her adult daughter, and they were told by them that Jeff came over to discuss what was going on at his property around 8 p.m. So again, it all makes sense. They left about 6 p.m. They stopped for dinner at Burger King. They got home. They talked to the police, and then Jeff went to the neighbor's house and talked to them. So the initial police detectives, Wiersema and Ballot, cleared Jeff Titus. And so what we could see is that the case eventually went cold in the early 1990s. And then about 2000, a cold case team was brought to bear on the case. And the cold case team reopened the case. And as far as we can tell, they never seriously considered any other suspects other than Jeff Titus. And they really didn't have any additional evidence or information other than the fact that Jeff sometimes talked to his coworkers about the murders that had happened on his property line. But he never made any self-implicating statements. He simply said, there was this murder that happened, double murder happened near my property line. One other fact that the cold case team found suspicious was that when police found the victims, one of the victims was missing his gun. One of the hunters was missing his gun. And a couple of days later on Monday, Jeff called the police. He also called the local media, local paper, to tell them that he had found the gun about 100 feet away from the hunters. And the cold case team found that very suspicious as well, that Jeff was the one who reported finding the missing gun from one of the hunters. But based entirely on the fact that Jeff had earlier confrontations with hunters who had wandered onto his property, that he talked about the case quite a bit at work, and that he had found the gun, they concluded Jeff Titus was the killer. And
sorry to interrupt, but was there one other issue in that one of the witnesses that had previously verified that he had been 27 miles away, like his memory became not reliable because of dementia or something like that?
I'm getting to that. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So,
sorry.
So that was it. And remarkably, the cold case team didn't even talk to the original detectives. They did not interview Wiersema and Ballot, who had cleared Jeff. They had their own theory. They talked to a behavioral unit at the FBI, which supposedly told them that they should be looking for a guy who's a lot like Jeff Titus, kind of an outdoorsman, a hunter, a hunter who's territorial about his property. So all these things convinced most of the cold case team, and I'll come back to that in a bit, most of the cold case team that Jeff was the guy. They executed a search warrant in his house, didn't find really anything of interest other than the fact that there were some newspaper articles that he had saved about the killings on the edge of his property line. And that was enough for them to be convinced to go ahead and arrest Jeff Titus and charge him with 2 counts of murder. Well, what about the alibi? As Kia brought up, Jeff's got what seems like a really good alibi, and the alibi ends up being demolished at his trial in 2002 on several fronts. First of all, it was an elderly couple whose farm he was hunting on. And by the time Jeff went to trial 12 years later, they both had dementia and therefore were unable to testify on Jeff's behalf. Jeff had a hunting partner who hunted with him, but they split up and went to separate blinds to do the hunting, which allowed the prosecution to develop this theory. And the theory is so ludicrous, so outlandish that you'll think I'm making it up, but I'm not. The theory was that Jeff is out there hunting in the next county, and he suddenly becomes concerned that there might be hunters from the game area who are trespassing on his land in the next county. And so he sneaks off of the farm where he's hunting, drives 27 miles back to his home, finds two hunters who are too close to his property line, kills them, steals their deer, no less. They've got a deer in this theory. He steals their deer, then drives back to the other county in time to pick up his hunting partner as if nothing had happened and go home. Well, first of all, the elderly couple who owned the property had destroyed that when they, just days after the killings, they confirmed that Jeff and his partner were there and didn't leave until 6 p.m. But the theory makes no sense. But one way they were able to bolster it is they kept interviewing the adult daughter of the neighbor. And remember, these are the people who said that Jeff came over to discuss the killings about 8 p.m. But they get the daughter to change her story. And now she says that conversation actually happened sometime around 6 p.m. And then by the time of trial, the conversation has now moved forward to about 5:15 p.m. So now she's placing Jeff in the neighborhood of where the killings occurred just a few minutes after the killings occurred. Completely changed her story. Unfortunately, Jeff had a not great lawyer at trial, a lawyer who a few years later would be disbarred. And that lawyer really did not impeach the witness, the neighbor, with the earlier statement that was made by her mother in front of her to the police that that conversation happened at 8. And the lawyer didn't do what we think the lawyer should have done, faced with the fact that the shepherds, the couple who had the farm where Jeff was hunting, had dementia. He should have called the police officers. He should have called Detectives Wiersema and Ballot and have them establish the alibi. After all, the shepherds had signed a written statement that Jeff was there all afternoon, and the shepherds couldn't authenticate that written statement, but the detectives could, and it's certainly the best evidence that would have been available under Michigan's version of the residual hearsay exception. That should have come in, but that wasn't done. We also discovered fairly soon that there was a member of the cold case team who dissented from these conclusions. His name was Rich Madison, and he firmly believed that they were barking up the wrong tree and Jeff had nothing to do with this. And so the response of the cold case team was to remove him from the case. And that wasn't revealed to the defense, that Rich Madison had done his own analysis of the crime scene and concluded that the prosecution's theory, the police theory, was wrong. So we went to court on Jeff's behalf. We filed a post-conviction motion in the state trial court arguing ineffective assistance of counsel for failing to call the original officers. In fact, trial counsel never even interviewed the original officers who had cleared his client. And that also there was a Brady violation in failing to disclose the analysis that had been done by the dissenting member of the cold case team, who then was subsequently removed from the case. We held an evidentiary hearing in 2014, and unfortunately, the trial judge ruled against us on everything. Said, for example, that the Shepard's statements and their written statement wouldn't even fall within the residual hearsay exception, and therefore it wasn't ineffective assistance to not try and get that in through the detectives. We filed then a federal habeas petition. Because Jeff had filed a previous federal habeas petition, we had to go to the Sixth Circuit Federal Appeals Court to get permission to file a successive habeas petition. Permission was granted on the Brady issue. So then we filed the Brady issue as a habeas claim in federal district court. And that gets us up to about 2018. And 2018 is an important year for us because that's the year that we got a new attorney general elected. And in 2019, the new attorney general announced that she was creating a conviction integrity unit. And that unit would be headed by Robin Frankel, who had been a colleague of mine. I'd known her for many years when we were at the State Appellate Defender Office together in the 1990s. The conviction integrity unit, as Robin will tell you, took quite a while to get geared up. But ultimately, what we decided to do was, while they're getting geared up and starting to look into this case, we decided to put the habeas case on hold. So we asked the federal district judge to put the habeas case on stay while Robin and her team looked at it. And so I think at this point, it makes sense to turn it over to Robin.
Yes, Robin, before we turn to you, is this, meanwhile, the man who we believe is the actual perpetrator,
Well, we don't know about him yet.
Okay.
So that's coming.
All right.
That's in part two.
Okay.
So Dave contacts me.
Welcome, Robin, again.
Thanks. My the AG announces our unit in the early part of spring of 2019, and I get hired. But when I first came in, to make a very long story short, we also had a huge backlog of cases under the Wrongful Imprisonment Compensation Act, and the AG tasked me with cleaning up those cases before we could get going on the CIU. So I did that for most of the first year. So the end of the year, the end of 2019, we start taking applications. We've got our protocols, we've got our applications, and this is one of the first cases that comes in. Now, we've also had applied for the DNA grant by that point, but the CIU in December of 2019 was made up of me. That's it. No support staff, no assistant, no investigator, no nobody. I look at this case. I read a little bit about it online. I talked to Dave about it. I'm very interested in it. And I made this crack at our state meeting last week, and I'm going to say it again. I was just like, oh, wow, this is great. What a great case. Let's stay the federal case, without really having any idea of what I was getting into. So that was the first strike against us with the local county, because Kalamazoo County about went through the roof when they heard that my habeas unit, the AG habeas unit, had stayed the case without looping them in. Regardless, so we stayed the case. Now we're at January, February, maybe, I can't even remember, 2019, early 2020.
And at this point, what else is available on this case?
Nothing. And as I'm starting to go through it, the problem is, okay, it's early 2020. I finally get a lawyer in the office, Lori Montgomery, who may or may not be watching. Lori gets hired. Her first day of work was the day the government shut down because of COVID. Our hiring goes into a freeze. I can't hire investigators that we've already interviewed. We have very little we can do. We're starting to read through files. And as I'm looking through Titus, my biggest concern is I don't like the case. I think there's something wrong with it. I don't see how the timeline works, but I'm struggling to find something new. This is what you're waiting for, Kia. I'm struggling. I've talked to Dave, talked to a couple of the media folks that had worked with Dave and Jeff Titus, watched some of the media coverage, and I'm like, I think the trial court was wrong. I think the original appeal should have been granted. I can't overturn a court. What am I going to do? Well, lo and behold, Dave worked some magic with the assistance of some media. And for some reason, they decided to go back to Kalamazoo County and look through the investigative files. Let me back up and just say this too. Remember, everybody, I'm a regional unit, and I think maybe there's a half a dozen of us or so in the country, maybe a little more now. So we're dealing with out county all the time, right? We don't have a home county. So in dealing with Kalamazoo County, which is about 2 to 3 hours from Detroit, where I'm stationed, what we always try and do is get the local counties to digitize and send us all their files. Kalamazoo County wouldn't do it. They kept saying the file was too big, they just couldn't do it, but we were welcome to come look at it whenever we wanted. And apparently they had done that, I believe, with Dave and his students and with some media folks. So apparently all kinds of folks were rooting around in the Kalamazoo County files. But in June of 2020, I got a call from Dave that they had gone back. And in the original investigation box, not the cold case investigation, the original investigation, on the bottom of the box is a manila folder that says serial killer and contains about 30 pages of information. Go ahead, Dave.
I should explain the reason why we were going through that huge file was, by this point, there was a podcaster, Susan Simpson, and a documentarian, Jacinda Davis, who were working this case. And Susan called me in the summer of 2020 and said, have you ever heard of a guy named Thomas Dillon? And I said, no. And she said, he's a serial killer in Ohio who specialized in killing hunters and other outdoorsmen, which is a weirdly specific form of serial killing, but there you have it. And that there were some pretty good indications that this could have been a Thomas Dillon case. He liked to drive hundreds of miles on weekends and kill hunters. He had killed a hunter the week before, November 17th, 1990, and he killed another hunter a week and a half after November 17th, 1990. And that they had obtained some documents suggesting that perhaps he was linked to the Kalamazoo case because they had filed some FOIAs in Ohio where he was ultimately convicted by plea of killing 5 hunters there. And in some of the documents they obtained by FOIA, there was indications that some of the Ohio authorities had linked him to this case from Kalamazoo County, Michigan. He was also suspected in killing hunters or outdoorsmen in Indiana and Pennsylvania as well. So that caused me to want to go look in the humongous file that they had in Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Department. So I went summer of 2020, sat in a room with a bunch of sheriff's deputies, all sitting about 6 feet apart wearing masks, and went through this huge file for 6 hours. And there was nothing of interest in this huge file except for near the very end of the search, finding this little manila folder where somebody had written in pencil serial killer. And there were about 30 pages of notes, or 30 pages of documents that really broke open the case. Back to you, Robin.
Thanks. The interesting part was most of the documents that were in this file about Thomas Dillon didn't include reports written by the Kalamazoo County Sheriff's officers who had been involved at that time. Most of these reports had to do with Tom Dillon and his arrest in the early 1990s for murders that he had committed in the early 1990s. One of the other interesting points that we have to go back on is at the time of the Kalamazoo killings, pretty much on the heels of hearing a series of shots in the woods, a neighbor lady by the name of Helen Knopf sees a car right around the corner from the game area that's driven into a ditch. And she and her 9-year-old son go running over there, and there's a guy in the ditch, and he's sweating, and he's anxious, and he doesn't want to talk to anyone. She offers to call the police and get him help, and no, he doesn't want the police. He's got a brother who lives down the road, or a brother-in-law lives down the road, and he just needs to get out of the ditch. And ultimately, someone comes and tows him out of the ditch, and off he goes, never to be heard from again. 2 days after Mrs. Knopf and her son witnessed this guy in the ditch, she draws a composite. And it's, fairly specific. She very specifically shaped wire rim glasses, face shape, and that sets in the file. And they never find anybody who matches it. Well, when Thomas Dillon comes to light in Ohio, a couple of things happen. And one of the things we find in this serial killer file in Kalamazoo County is a handwritten note from another out-county Michigan prosecutor. And he's written a note in 1993, and he sends it to Detective Wiersma, and he attaches to it a news article about Tom Dillon. And he writes in his note, "You probably already know about this guy, but I wanted you to see this." Sends it to him. Some of the other things in that file were Ohio police reports which are similar to what Dave mentioned earlier. Ohio police reports indicating that prior to November 17th, the day of the Kalamazoo killings, Tom Dillon borrowed 2 firearms from 2 different people that he worked with, told them he was using them to go hunting that weekend. Returned them after the weekend. One was returned without the barrel with the explanation of, oh, it was inadvertently thrown away. He told both of his colleagues that he'd killed a deer with their gun, but really he'd only killed 1 deer that day. The police reports that they had collected that were in the serial killer file also established that Tom Dillon did in fact shoot 1 deer that day in Ravenna, Ohio, but he was last seen in Ravenna, Ohio at noon. Now, the original detective, you might remember from that video, Wiersum said that he found Tom Dillon had an alibi and couldn't have been in the Kalamazoo County, in the Fulton game area on the 17th at 4:30 or 4:45. But when Dave and I talked, the reality was he figured it wrong. He was taking the distance from a certain area in Ohio all the way to Kalamazoo. The Fulton game area is east of Kalamazoo. So he had added like an hour or an hour and a half maybe of time. Tom Dillon had plenty of time. And while it seemed a little outlandish initially, the FBI reports that we obtained later and that Dave has mentioned and all the media reports are that Tom Dillon drove hundreds of miles at a time looking for people and animals and items to shoot. So it wasn't that outlandish. We also found in that file that Tom Dillon, except for one of his 5 murders, seemed to kill people on Saturdays, which was his day off. James Bennett and Doug Estes were both killed on a Saturday. Tom Dillon had a habit of leaving no evidence behind. There were no shells, there were no fingerprints, there was nothing that tied him to those offenses, except that when he got arrested in Ohio, it was for possession of some sort of a weapon, I believe, and ultimately he confessed to those 5 murders. They would have had nothing. In the murder case, in our murder case in Kalamazoo, there was no physical evidence. There were no slugs, or there were no shells, there were no fingerprints. There was nothing. Nothing that tied Jeff Titus, nothing that tied Tom Dillon, nothing that tied anyone. We also located probably one of the most interesting things in the file, and I think it was in the file, and then we were able to confirm it later. At some point, Detective Wiersum and another officer whose name escapes me, Van Streen, captain, I think, take Helen Knopf and her son Derek in 1993, I believe, maybe 92, 93. And they take them to Ohio, to Cohocton County, Ohio, where Tom Dillon's been arrested and is in custody. And they have a live lineup. And they do 2 independent live lineups, one with Helen and one with her now maybe 10-year-old son. And in both of those independent lineups, both of those people picked Tom Dillon as the man they thought they saw in the ditch on November 17th.
Wow. And how many years after did you say this was?
This was in
2 years after.
two years after.
Early 93.
Interestingly, no such report was ever in the file from a Kalamazoo County Sheriff's officer. Sidestep, and some of this was in the file and some of it we found later, and at this point it's all sort of jumbled together. One of the things we located at some point was an article, a couple of our media articles in Ohio newspapers where Van Streen, can't remember his name, Van Streen had talked to the media and said to the media, we took our witnesses down to Ohio and had them look at Tom Dillon. They didn't pick anyone out. He's no longer a suspect. Now, a couple of really surprising things. One, it's a lie. There's the first thing. The second part is there are no Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Department reports that reflect that this ever happened. Now, Detective Wiersum has told us that he has a memory of writing a report and he doesn't know why it's not in the file. And I know he told that to the Kalamazoo County prosecutor as well. So we have all of that. And once we get all this information, of course, I know that Dave has given it to me. I need to follow up on it. We need to independently confirm. So we take all this.
There are a couple more pieces. One is the Helen Knobs, the witness who saw the guy we call Ditch Guy. Ditch Guy was driving a compact 1980s car, and she described the car in great detail, and the car really fit the description of the Chevy Chevette that Tom Dillon's wife owned. And the Ohio police established that sometimes Tom Dillon used his wife's car on the weekend. Sometimes he used his own pickup truck to go out and find hunters and kill them. And the second thing was a guy named Mike Chappelle.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to.
Was a jail inmate who played chess with Tom Dillon after Tom Dillon was arrested. And Tom Dillon told Mike Chappelle that on one occasion he had killed 2 hunters at once, but the police couldn't place him in that county. So he hadn't been charged for that. All of the other known cases of Tom Dillon involved 1 hunter being killed. So we had all of these pieces all fitting together really nicely in this little slim file, serial killer file.
Wow.
And
in addition to the evidence that the podcaster and the documentarian had obtained from the Ohio police through FOIA.
Okay.
So we went down to try and follow up on as much as we could and see what we could or couldn't confirm, although we have police reports. 2 of our investigators went
collaboratively, or was this part of the investigation just the AG's?
This was fairly independent. What we did afterwards, although I was relatively regularly would call Dave, and his students would be trying to locate information for us. If I couldn't find it, because I knew that they had their hands on the file, they could locate it. Dave had given me contact information for Susan Simpson, who quite honestly was very helpful and very forthcoming, and spoke with with the CIU investigators on a couple of different occasions. So we decided that our investigators should go down to Ohio. So our 2 investigators went down to Ohio. They met with the Cohocton County Sheriff's Department. They looked through the files on site in Cohocton County. They pulled a bunch of stuff out. They made contact with the FBI officer who was now retired, but who had overseen the investigation on Tom Dillon. They talked to the cellmate who's still around. They talked to the 2 hunting partners who are still around, and confirmed everything that they had put in their statements back in the 90s. They all remembered all of it. So then, of course, comes the next part, which is when you're in a local prosecutor's office running a CIU and you have all of this that appears to be a huge Brady violation, a screaming Brady violation, you go to your elected and say, this is what we have. We've got a regional unit, and so we have political complications that I've talked to lots of people about over the years. And that is, the Attorney General is the top law enforcement agent in the state. She may very well, and I believe, have the power to step in on any case. But my boss is not going to do that. She is not going to usurp the power of the local county prosecutor. These are their cases and their blood, sweat, and tears, and she wants me to get the locals on board. Not only that, but we're never going to get anywhere in the future if we make enemies out of everyone. So one of the things that I learned, in addition to incredible patience, is you can win without getting people to hate you, because I know that's oftentimes a huge problem. Not that the cold case detectives are fast friends. They probably don't have much to say to us. But in terms of dealing with the county, we went out after we got all this information and we confirmed everything. Last summer, we went out to Kalamazoo County. Me, Lori Montgomery, who's the other assistant in my unit, and our 2 investigators. And the 4 of us went out to Kalamazoo County. We met with the local elected. We met with 2 of his top level folks, and we sat in a room for probably 2 or 3 hours, and we told them everything that we had found. We told them everything, and we gave them everything. Our investigators keep meticulous investigative reports. We turned over every single report. We turned over every single recorded interview. We turned over every single piece of paper that we had gotten, not only through Dave and his folks, but everything that we had picked up when we were down in Ohio and the FBI information that we had collected, and we gave them everything. The downside, and the patience comes with, he wants to review it all. And as irritating as it is, right, because we know we've done good, honorable work, I get that it's his county and his case. This is not the prosecutor who was there when the case was tried. And not only that, but Dave will confirm for you that there is no love lost between the Kalamazoo County Prosecutor's Office and the U of M Innocence Clinic over this case.
Yeah, I mean, so on that point, Dave, I mean, what kept you from, you know, filing it or a supplement or something in an adversarial nature? You know, if you or if Mr. Titus were getting anxious and wanting things to move forward?
Well, we really did want things to move forward. We were very concerned about Mr. Titus's health. He's elderly. He was in a prison that repeatedly had massive COVID outbreaks, especially early in the pandemic. Lots of people died in the facility where he was being held. His mother was very sickly, and Jeff desperately wanted to get out before his mother died. Unfortunately, she died last year before the week. So Jeff really wanted to move things along. So did we. And so we had so many conversations with the students and I on one side and Robin on the other about you know, how we could move this thing along. But we knew that if we just went ahead and filed a new post-conviction motion with what we had, Kalamazoo County was not going to go along with it. And it was going to take probably years of litigation. And we would probably lose in that county in front of that bench. And so we would probably be spending years of appealing with no really good likelihood of success, despite the power of the evidence we had. So we weren't patient, but as Robin will tell you, we were persistent to the point of nagging, but we really couldn't abandon the process.
Yeah, so
And we did. Towards the end, there was a conversation Dave and I and his students had maybe in October, November. We'd been waiting 4, 5, 6 months for Kalamazoo County to tell me whether they were going to go along or not. Because if they weren't, we needed to find an alternative. And in this case, the habeas gave us an alternative, even if Kalamazoo County said no. But I needed to know what their position was before I could go to my boss and make a recommendation. So on the one hand, I'm talking to Dave and his students, and I remember the conversation where David asked me, at what point are you not going to wait for them anymore? And it must have been October, November. And I said, give me till the end of the year. At the end of the year, we didn't have an answer. I went to my boss. We sort of, I don't want to call it an ultimatum, but sent a follow-up to Kalamazoo County saying, here's where we are. Here's how we see this going. Here are the ways it can be resolved. What do you want to do? Now, in the interim, I've been having fairly I've been having some irregular contacts with Kalamazoo County. They would send me, the elected would send me questions. I would answer them, send them back. He clearly was reviewing everything, but it was just a lot slower than I wanted it to be, much slower than Dave and his client wanted it to be. But once we reached the point in early January where we said, tell us what your position is, he agreed. Ultimately, the facts of the case were what the facts of the case were. And it's interesting, there was a press briefing after Mr. Titus was released, and it was with the Attorney General and Jeff Getting, being the Kalamazoo County prosecutor. And there were some questions posed to him about how this could happen. And he said, and he was pretty clear. He said, you know what? I don't know how it happened. I can't explain it, but it happened. That file was there. It is very powerful information. I'm not going to sit here and say Tom Dillon's the murderer. I think there's another theory out there, quite honestly, but that's not the point. The point is that there is no excuse for this information not being turned over to defense. And you know what? Let me back up. It's not that it wasn't turned over to the defense only. It wasn't turned over to the prosecutor. Nowhere in the prosecutor's file does this information exist. And I don't think Dave or I doubt that the prosecutors didn't have it.
Yeah, we actually filed a FOIA to see if it was in the prosecutor's file, and they came back with the name Dylan never appears in the prosecutor's file.
And they went through it again after we met with them whatever summer it was. They went through it, last summer. They went through their file again to make absolutely 100% sure. The trial lawyer didn't know who it was, had never heard the name before. I still have some question about the cold case team. There's a documentary, and Dave can give you the site for it. I can't remember, but it was an ID documentary where the cold case detectives, so full of themselves, insist that they knew nothing about this. This was all new to them. But there's a report prepared, and I can't remember whose name it was. David, call me later and I'll find it.
Gwen Romanek.
Right. And in that cold case report, there's a discussion with Helen Knopf and about the man she saw in the car in the ditch. And she specifically makes a comment about, well, it's like when I went down to Ohio and I said, that guy looks most like him. But you know what? These guys were so focused on Jeff Titus, I'm convinced they read right over it.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Kia, can I share screen, show one thing?
Sure, let me make you a co-host. Okay.
So remember, Robin mentioned that Helen Knopf produced a composite sketch of the guy in the ditch. Here's a side-by-side with Tom Dillon. I can make that bigger. Can you see that?
No, are you sharing your screen?
I thought it was. Let me try again. Oh, there we go. Can you see it now?
There.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Look at the shape of those glasses.
And the round face. It's remarkable. Just as she very accurately described his wife's car, she very accurately described Dylan as well.
So if she was brought to ID him, then somebody in the sheriff's office connected.
But that was 93. That was before the cold case team got involved. So what we know is that the cold case team, they re-interviewed Helen Knopf in 2002, and she told them that she'd gone to identify a guy in Ohio, but it doesn't appear that they followed up on it at all.
No, there's not even a follow-up question. Nothing. And it's just incredible that the word Ohio doesn't appear anywhere in those files.
Wow.
And the cold case guys insist they didn't know anything about it.
It's not really helping their case. They had no idea because it's like.
No, Dave, you have to tell them about the Wood TV report from yesterday or 2 days ago.
So Kia showed you a brief clip from Wood TV station in that part of the state that's been covering the case extensively. The same reporter did another follow-up where he interviewed one of the original members of the cold case team, who is the most committed to Jeff being guilty. And he, on camera, said, he's not surprised that Jeff got out because we've got a socialist president now. And he also blamed George Soros. To which I confess, yeah, okay, we're a George Soros front. You got us.
Right. And again, folks, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or take yourselves off mute. I had two questions. One is, how is Mr. Titus doing now? He's been out for a couple of weeks. Is that it? 2 weeks?
Yeah.
How is he
He's doing remarkably well. He is staying with a cousin who supported him. He's very sad about the passing of his mother. He's very sad about a lot of things that happened to him. One of the really bad things that happened to him is I mentioned his not very good lawyer. His not very good lawyer hired a not terrific investigator.
Even worse, worse investigator.
An even worse investigator who then, after Jeff was convicted and sent to prison, promptly married Jeff's wife. So
Which
that
makes you wonder about the level of investigation he was doing.
Yeah, really makes you wonder about that. But Jeff has reunited with, he had 2 daughters. He's reunited with one of them. The other one is actually a NASA scientist in California that he's looking forward to seeing. He hasn't had a chance to see her yet. Jeff is a decorated Marine. He actually served on Marine One, the president's helicopter during the Nixon administration. And, he had a distinguished life as a military veteran, and he worked at a VA hospital. I think he's past doing those things again, but he's really, in the 11 days he's been out, he's done a lot of things that he used to do in the old days. When he got out, he said one of the very first things he wanted to do was get a New York cheesecake donut at a particular donut shop in Kalamazoo. And he got that. And in fact, the manager called me up afterwards, after that interview aired, and said, we can make that happen. I want to give him a gift basket. It turns out Jeff had actually filmed a commercial for that particular donut shop before all this happened. And the manager said that he'd like to put Jeff in another commercial now. So people are aware of his case. I've gotten a lot of outreach from people in the community who want to see if they can help Jeff in various ways. So I think Jeff will do fine. He's learning to use a cell phone. He's getting his driver's license. He's going to be pretty independent pretty quickly, I think.
That's great. And then my other question was for Dave and Robin. I mean, just what lessons did you learn from this process, particularly on proceeding collaboratively? If there's anything, any suggestions you have for folks watching who are also, trying to proceed collaboratively with their counterparts on a case, maybe.
Well, it was the sharing that broke us. It was because Dave was willing to share all of the information and all of his processes with us that we were able to move forward as quickly as we could. But the other lesson that I learned is not necessarily a collaborative lesson, but a worthwhile one. And Lori and I have talked about this a lot in the last couple of weeks. This is our fifth release. And in this case and our last case, we saw the same Brady problem. And the Brady problem is anytime an investigation is taken over by a second law enforcement agency or a second law enforcement team, you have to go and you have to look at the original files. This was a cold case, so you had an original team, and 10, 20 years later, a cold case team. The other case we had dealt with a local city police department, which wasn't getting good results, and so the county came in and took over and did the same thing. They thought that the city had done a piss poor job and said, fuck that, we're not looking at their stuff. We're going to start over from scratch. But the city had information in its file that was exculpatory. That was also one of Dave's cases on DeJesus. So the lesson is go to the original law enforcement agency, go through the files by yourself. Don't trust them to make copies and send them. Go look.
Of course, the AGCIU gets to do that. Usually the local police agency won't let us do it. It was remarkable that I was allowed to spend 6 hours in the file room going through this huge file in Kalamazoo. And the reason I was able to do that was because Roy Ballett, who by that point was a retired police detective, contacted his friends in the sheriff's department and helped grease the wheels so they would let me in. So I could go through the file myself. Otherwise, we probably never would have found that thin little manila envelope that had serial killer on it.
Right, it's really important. We had one question in the chat of how did the victims' families react?
Yeah, just briefly, the local prosecutor wanted to do his own victim contacts, and he wanted to do the cold case contacts. So I didn't have direct contact with them, but I did see an article in the paper, and maybe it was a Wood TV article. Dave, you might have seen it, where Estes' wife said if he didn't do it, she's glad he's out, that she'd always had some doubts, which I was sort of surprised by.
Yeah.
By the way, one loose end I don't think we mentioned is that we couldn't go talk to Dylan himself because he died in prison in 2011.
Yeah, but if you ever want to do some serial killer research, the guy is just, he's a serial killer. IQ of 135. I can talk about all these things, but I can't send everyone the documents, I don't think. There was a psych eval, 135 IQ, worked for the Canton Water Department, took his
engineering degree from Ohio State.
Took his first pot shot through a living room window at a guy sitting on his couch in the 1980s. Had killed probably hundreds of farm animals, domesticated animals, wild animals, had set maybe 1,000 arsons, and then graduated to killing folks. The Indiana case that we saw that he was a potential suspect on was closed, but there's a case out of Philadelphia that is still cold. But we think he didn't want to confess to Philadelphia because there was a death penalty in Philadelphia. And I don't think he wanted to talk about Michigan because he wanted to stay in Ohio. He had a wife and a son, and he wanted to stay in Ohio.
Wow.
Yeah, interesting dude.
Well, thank you so much again. And I put the post-meeting evaluation out. So if you wouldn't mind filling that out, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you all so much again for joining. Stay tuned for emails about our meeting next month. Not sure exactly what the program will be, but we will figure that out and send that out in the next few weeks. Also, thanks Destiny for reminding me to send out those model policies from after our last month's meeting, so we'll send those out as well. And thanks so much again for joining us. And thank you, Robin and Dave, for your incredible work and for telling us all about it. We really appreciate hearing about it. Thanks again.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.